Hi, everybody. Well, I spoke with Claire just before her talk, and she said that she would prefer I don't read her bio and that I just speak a little bit casually with you about who she is and why we invited her. I think we all know who she is, but why we invited her here. We all know that Claire has worked with great artists and thinkers internationally, and that she's been doing, she has a history of developing socially engaged work alongside artists and in communities. And we invited her here partly because we anticipated also this rich discussion that would take place in the intensive class, which we had earlier this week. And I think I'm just going to keep this really brief, but I just would like to pull a few of the phrases that I left in my notebook from that, because I think those really speak to why she's here. And those are that she was talking about how artists, the role of an artist is to be a charismatic agent. And I think that's a really good way to think of what we're doing. And that that sort of part of that process is to create residue in a space. And I thought that just keeps cycling through my thoughts this weekend. And I think that's a really wonderful way of phrasing it. And then she also spoke about curators as the protector of ideas, which I also think is a really important way of positioning the curator role. And together, I think that those two make a really excellent pair. And so that's my take on that. And without further ado, I'll just let you go. Claire Doherty.
Thank you. Everybody, hi, 2212, is it? I hope you're doing okay. I'd just like to say it's a huge privilege. Incredible peers. Can you hear? Is it dropped out? Okay. So it's a real privilege to be here with so many incredible peers. I hope you're having a brilliant time. And I'd just like to say thank you most of all to the artists who I spent the day with on Thursday. It was a phenomenal day. I don't know how you kept going. And this is why I'm here, for those kinds of conversations. You know what? Keynotes are a strange thing. They either set the pace and the field and survey the territory, or they can act as a kind of anchor. And I know that on a scattered site kind of conference like this, it can feel sometimes that you're kind of in a partial conversation, and there are very limited opportunities to get together. So what I'm hoping we'll do in just over an hour here together is maybe to anchor some of the questions, discussions, debates, arguments, problems, and to figure out together some of the things that are at stake. So when we go out that door, and we go into our things this afternoon and onwards to tomorrow, maybe we've kind of crystallized some of the language we want to use. We've brought things up to date a little bit, maybe, rather than going back in the past and setting the dial to zero, as Tom was saying to me earlier. And I want to try and do that by provoking that debate by letting you in on a story of a single work. And I think that, which I'll come to in a minute, but I think what I was thinking about when I was going to come to Portland was that this is a place I've never been to before. I am an alien in every way. I'm certainly out of time, and I feel like an outsider, but I'm coming to a conference in which I guess I might be thought of or think of myself as an insider. You know, a conference such as this draws us together in the hope of perhaps recognizing something familiar together, finding a familiar language, relating to each other and going, yeah, that's exactly the experience I have. But at the same time, we want to seek out the possibilities of encountering something strange. And that was certainly what we experienced last night in Shine a Light. I'm thinking of Paul's bells ringing out that familiar refrain, which uncannily is the song which I was going to play this morning. This land is our land. Only to be made unfamiliar by them being dispersed across the museum. Equally, Pablo's mock projects yesterday, which infuriated some, dissected by a mock panel of social scientists, you know, operated on this idea of of disrupting this bond between a presenter and a listener, of what I am about to tell you is authentic, is true in some way. And of course, many of the interventions by the artists last night deployed a kind of tactic of interruption. A flash mob party in the lift. I was so British, I just stood there going like that. The reinsertion of female artists into the museum through these flashing LEDs, really beautiful. And the reappropriation of familiar objects and services. They all seem to kind of defamiliarize, if you like, that safe space. As Fred Wilson said, a safe place for unsafe ideas. So, I want to begin today thinking of that familiarity and unfamiliarity, the strange and the familiar, by reading from 3 artists. I always like to start with the words of artists, somehow. From very different times and very different places. Some of this will be very familiar to you, some won't be. So the first is from Tony Smith, from 1966. When I was teaching at Cooper Union in the first year or two of the 1950s, someone told me how I could get onto the unfinished New Jersey Turnpike. I took 3 students and drove them somewhere in the meadows to New Brunswick. It was a dark night, and there were no lights or shoulder markers, lines, railings, or anything at all except the dark pavement moving through the landscape of the flats, rimmed by hills in the distance, but punctuated by stacks, towers, fumes, and coloured lights. This drive was a revealing experience. The road and much of the landscape was artificial, and yet it couldn't be called a work of art. On the other hand, it did something for me that art had never done. At first, I didn't know what it was, but its effect was to liberate me from many of the views I had had about art. It seemed that there had been a reality there which had not had any expression in art. The experience on the road was something mapped out, but not socially recognized. I thought to myself, it ought to be pretty clear that's the end of art. Most painting looked pretty pictorial after that. There is no way you can frame it. You just have to experience it. And this is Hamish Fulton from 1970, some 3 years later. In the spring of 1970, I visited the Isle of Arran off the west coast of Scotland. One day I decided to swim the half-mile stretch of sea between King's Cross on Arran and the lighthouse on Holy Island. I had never been to Holy Island. As I was swimming close to the rocks by the lighthouse, I saw a man and a woman walking over the rocks towards me. They gave me a hand out onto the land. The man was my geography teacher from school, whom I had not seen for 6 years. He is now the lighthouse keeper on the island. And this is Adam Chodsko from 2000. My art is not just about looking, but about looking for something, searching for something that is missing at present. This notion of looking for takes place partly in public space, but also in interior space, the imagination of the inhabitants of that public space. As an example, a public space could simply be a network of people who all happened to dream 2 nights ago about a fox. They don't know each other, nor do they know that each shared the same elements in a dream. And after recognizing the existence of this public space, a less literal notion of it must also acknowledge all the people whose dreams did not feature a fox. The idea of looking for something proposes an expansion of vision to accommodate that which we did not previously know, or perhaps that what we previously did not want to know. What are we looking for in public space? Absorption through kinship and intimacy? Or are we seeking confirmation of our difference and entering public space wanting separation, the definition of a unique identity for ourselves? Okay, So I came here today with a number of questions in my head that will kind of frame my discussion of this particular work. And they are, what do you think we're searching for? What are we looking for? What do we recognize as social practice and not? Who are the insiders? And who is on the outside looking in? And how does such work invoke an idea of public time as well as public space? Now for me, this image of a solitary man in the high Arctic of Svalbard is perhaps the antithesis of what we recognize to be social practice. Many of the talks and panel discussions over the last couple of days have been filled with images like this: reverie, collective experience, celebration, festivities. They're affirmative. This was a work that we commissioned as part of my organisation Situations with the artists Heather and Ivan Morrison. It's a barn raising of a rather remarkable pavilion in a park in Bristol. It was there for 4 months. It's affirmative, it's productive. And that might be carried across to Amy Franceschini's Future Farmers project, which is happening right now in Oslo in Norway, which we commissioned as part of a public art programme. Often we commission works that are part of wider urban regeneration programmes. And this might well be identified of what we recognise as social practice. Again, affirmative. To build a public bakehouse, a permanent public bakehouse on the edges of the fjord there. It's productive, it's open and efficient. Full of lots of work and labour, collective activity of bringing people together who had never met before and making things happen one could never expect to happen in a corporate environment such as that. And this was yesterday, the building of a temporary oven by the Future Farmers. Or this, the work of Lara El Mercigui, a Spanish artist who was commissioned as part of One Day Sculpture, a series of international commissions, each of which occurred over 24 hours in New Zealand. A project which brought together the histories of a number of houses that were for sale in this amazing boatyard just outside of the city of Wellington, brought together from all over New Zealand. In some ways, it was a restorative project, restoring the histories of those works and bringing together the former residents of those houses. These works are magnetic that we produce, whether they be sculptural. In some cases, they relate to social history. So I find my funding applications to funders are full of images like this, of people being somehow drawn to a particular work and its history. Is this what we recognize as social practice? Or this, activist, strident. This is a part of a work by a brilliant young artist called Liz Allen in New Zealand, who staged a one-day festival of to restore the reputation of a writer called Ronald Hugh Morrison. The town, who didn't particularly like him, had built a Kentucky Fried Chicken over his birthplace. So this was about conducting a series of readings in Kentucky Fried Chicken to mark his birthday. Or this, the process of exchange. This is a work by Superflex, which was conducted in a bank in Auckland, whereby all the workers of the bank agreed not to say the word dollars for 24 hours. Now, is that what we recognize as social practice? Affirmative, productive, restorative, a magnet for people, activist, strident, a process of exchange. Let's look again. This work was called The Black Cloud. In fact, it was a deeply foreboding work. It was made through burnt wood. It had this kind of ominous form. And it was nicknamed the woodlouse by residents that lived around. Yes, it brought people together, but actually it was inspired by a future vision of Bristol as a kind of burnt out place in which you would have to seek shelter from the burning sun. this work occurs in the shadow of corporate action, deeply, deeply political as a gesture. We were talking earlier in a discussion in response to one of the panel discussions about what's possible with capital that comes through urban regeneration programs to act within it. Well, Future Farmers have shown what they're doing is in fact a deeply political act within this new waterfront department area. And they're actually restoring a series of grain production. So this becomes a very different image when you start to think of this as a series of viral activities that are going on in the shadow of urban development in Oslo, one of Europe's richest cities. And this, in fact, yes, it's a restorative work of the histories of these places. But these buildings, these small movable houses, also tell the stories of displacement. They are, in fact, displaced in themselves as sculptural forms, if you like. Many of the houses were moved as burial grounds of Maori tribes were restored. They hold the histories, perhaps, of homes that have been moved due to motorways being built or freeways across New Zealand. So in themselves, this work is imbued with a sense of melancholy. It's actually deeply, deeply disturbing as a list. And of course, it's set out in the form of a real estate advert. And this is a work by the artist Hugh Locke. It resides in a graveyard in Bristol called St. Paul's. And it's a series of gravestones which mark the death of various companies. So it's a series of gravestones. One of them is Enron. And it marks the point in St. Paul's, which is actually a node in the drug trade network. It implicates St. Paul's as being absolutely at the heart of an economic network which is involved, in which there have been huge amounts of casualties in that Bristol area. And here, of course, this is discordant and can never be restored in some ways. This writer's home is gone. There's a sort of sense in which there was a certain festivity around him, but then the day after this took place, people were buying, well, not chicken McNuggets, but buckets, I guess, of Kentucky Fried Chicken. And here, of course, one could think about Superflex's work as this kind of economic interruption. What they were most interested in is this kind of butterfly effect of not writing or saying the word dollars for 24 hours, how in fact it might actually, even though it felt very cozy and people thought it very funny, and the bankers put out balloons to mark the day they weren't going to say dollars, could this in fact have brought down the whole economic system? So I show you these images, which are part of works that we've been involved with over the last 10 years, as a kind of precursor to contextualize, talking of context, this problem, I have as a curator and as a producer of what's familiar, what I recognize as social practice, what do I recognize that I'm producing. Artists, more often than not, completely surprise me in what emerges from their work. And Nowhere Island, the project I'm going to talk about, is a particular case in that. So back in 2009, in the UK, there was a great deal of debate about the forthcoming Olympics. At that point, it was seen as a complete waste of money, and the headline at that point was, "The Great in Britain is at stake." There was a lot of jingoistic, colonialist kind of language surrounding the forthcoming Olympics. But in terms of site and place, this is kind of what we were looking at. This is the site of the Olympic Park, 2010. So there was a sense of great expectation. One of the reasons that London was awarded the Olympics was because, as part of their bid, they've put forward to stage a cultural Olympiad, a celebration of culture and sport, as opposed to just the sporting activities. And we saw this Olympic Park develop through the incorporation of artistic activities and artworks such as Anish Kapoor's ArcelorMittal tower. This became, in some ways, the kind of precursor of what was to follow. This is actually a CGI image, I should say. And there was a sense in which, very much from up above, there was a notion that any artistic activities going on as part of the Cultural Olympiad would be monumental, spectacular, and of course, participatory in some form. So the language was almost reappropriated at that point in terms of the Cultural Olympiad, of what artistic activity and cultural experience would be during this period of time. Now, at the beginning, what began to have happen, this is a planning permission for the work, which always makes me laugh. At the time, what I began to see happen was that there was a sort of series of agitations around the edges of this kind of activity. And it seemed to me, I spoke at the Creative Time Summit a little while ago, that what happened was a kind of polarization between either you were going to deliver something spectacular and monumental, or you were going to poke a stick at it. So this is the work of Hilary Powell, in which she staged her own informal amateur Olympics around the Olympic Park, using the derelict objects that were in that space, reclaiming it, if you like. But of course, as things progressed, it became very clear that there was very little room for dissent, of discordance. I couldn't imagine at that point how we were going to be able to produce work as part of the Cultural Olympiad. And then I got a phone call. And this is where the story starts. So the phone rings, and it's this guy on the other end called Alex Hartley, who I'd met a few times, but I didn't know very well. And Alex said, I'm standing on the edge of a cliff, Claire. And I said, sorry? I'm standing on the edge of a cliff, Claire. And I said, okay. And he said, I've got this idea. And I was like, uh-huh. And he said, you know my work, don't you? And I said, yeah, I know your work, Alex. And he's a studio-based artist, primarily working in photo montage and photography. Not known for spectacular works, but perhaps the thing I most knew him well for was this work in 2004. And he had taken part in an expedition to the high Arctic with the organization Cape Farewell, which many of you will know, I'm sure. It's an organization dedicated to artistic responses to climate change. And they've taken musicians, artists, choreographers, dancers, etc., to the Arctic to respond in whatever way they seem fit to the conditions in the high Arctic. So Rachel Whiteread's Turbine Hall installation came out of Cape Farewell. Ian McEwan's book Solar came out of that particular experience, and Alex went in 2004. And as Alex was sort of doing his on the cliff, I then remembered actually that I did know his work very well, because I had been to see the exhibition from Cape Farewell and had come across this piece, which is his work, which came out of his visit to the high Arctic. As part of that particular experience, he had sought out and claimed an island that had been revealed because of the retreating ice of a melting glacier. And he had gone through the processes of naming and claiming that island as his own, as the artwork. So this collage of photographs, documents, etc., traced in the form of the island that process. I was particularly interested in it because to some degree it kind of rehearsed a sort of early 20th century male endeavor, sole male endeavor of the heroic artist. And this was his diary entry from the 19th of September 2004. And it said, "We surveyed the island, taking longitude and latitude readings for all features and extremities. A cairn was built, and in the age-old style, a claim note was placed inside a tin can, and this in turn was inserted into the cairn. The note stated in both English and Norwegian notice of claim on the newly revealed island. And in his subsequent request to the Norwegian government to cede the island from the Kingdom of Norway, he, if you like, summoned a vast body of literature in which the urge to seek out and possess the remote and unfamiliar landscapes of the edges of the world have been an enduring creative impulse. And I never quite knew whether maybe Alex was kind of, you know, he understood the irony of what he was doing. But then as I got to know him, I understood exactly what he was doing in these kinds of poses that he was adopting. Rather camp with his leg kind of out here. But I also, at the time, I had stood in front of this for quite some time. One thing that struck me was that Alex's response to climate change was the only one which invoked the present tense, the political implication of that place we see as being so remote from this world. Many of the others kind of invoked a sort of romantic notion of ice-capped mountains, as opposed to one which was deeply implicated in the politics of nationhood. So I then said to Alex, yep, okay, I remember who you are. Nice to hear from you. And he said, I've had this idea for the Olympics, and I want to know whether you're interested. And he said, I want to bring the island that I discovered to southwest England as a visiting island nation. So I said, oh, you mean like Robert Smithson? So this image came in my head. And he went, yeah, sort of, not really, more like this. And I said, right. And he said, yeah, it's not quite the same, Claire, because it's within the context of the Olympics, you know, so it's as much about the fact the island will pass through international waters, and in doing so be declared its own nation. And I want this to be open to everyone in the world to become citizens of Nowhere Island. So I said, okay, so you mean like Utopia? I was really annoying curator. John Lennon and Yoko Ono's 1971 project. And he said, nah, not really like that. Because in a sense, he said, you know what, I don't want to set the parameters of what this nation will be. And also, this is a real place. This is a territory. This is a nation that's going to go in search of its people. So I said, okay, let's do it. So we began, and we went to the Arctic to find the island. For those of us who are as bad as me as geography, this is us. This is Svalbard. Svalbard is the northernmost landmass in the world. It sits only about 2 hours from the North Pole, and you reach it if you're flying via Oslo and then Tromsø in the north of Norway, and then you fly over what they colloquially call as the Devil's Dance Floor, which is the Barents Sea in between the tip of Norway. It's particularly politically rife because nations have fought over Svalbard for many, many years in terms of mining rights. It's actually now in the Kingdom of Norway, but a number of different nations have mining rights over that particular place. And this is where this work began to change. So it begins with this soul artist's endeavor, this vision standing on the edge of a cliff, imagining this floating island coming round the headland as a visiting island nation, and begins to turn into something else, something in which more than one artist is invested in, something which actually goes out of his control and his hands. And it begins with taking an expedition team with us on this sailing boat. This is sort of how we began. 17 of us. We took, Alex and I decided that we should take with us the people we think you should maybe set up a new nation with, or at least who you could advise you on that. They included a psychologist, a feminist activist, an environmentalist, 3 young people under the age of 18, and a number of other people, from a professor in linguistics, a geographer, a magician, actually, which was useful, and that we would take this expedition with them. And we found the island. In fact, a third of the island had already dropped away into the sea. And just before we left, we got permission from the Norwegian government to remove the territory. And the letters are extraordinary, which you can find on the website, in that they agreed to this in the spirit of international exchange. So, we arrived at this island. It's an extraordinary place. Yes, it has visions like this, with glaciers retreating faster than you can imagine. It also had very, very rough seas. We got caught in the tail of Hurricane Katia, which was an interesting for me, suffering from seasickness. And we went onto the island and enacted a process by which we left a note on the bedrock of the island, and we removed a portion of the top of the island to take with us south.
Normally you would be able to go closer with the Norderlicht to the glacier than the Zodiac, because with the ship it's more safe. But here the ship can't get close because of the shallow area.
Bit, Jeff.
With glaciers, it's not that the big ones are the nicest. This is a nice, very active one. A lot of crevasses and a lot of pieces breaking off. This has happened for many, many years, for centuries, for thousands of years, because we're not living in an ice age. So it is normal that this glacier retreats, but they do say, and I believe it, that it's going faster because of global warming. It is getting warmer here, that's what we notice. So I feel always very double when I see big pieces breaking off. We always sort of shout and we want to see it, but it's also a sign that the glacier is retreating. When I started here 14 years ago, the ice was here where we are. This was in the ice already 10 years ago, and much further down there, there was the edge 14 years ago. So I've seen it changing a lot, and every year when I come here, I do see the change. I think it is good to show people areas like this, to bring people into nature, and especially in these areas that are, well, where things are going on, that are vulnerable. It is a cliche, but we need ambassadors. There's not many wildernesses left in the world. And now, as the industrialization is going faster, there's even less wildernesses than we have. Now, there are people that say we shouldn't go to Antarctica because if we go there, we spoil it. But if nobody goes there, then people don't know the value of it. I think now, like here, the Norwegians had ideas of closing big areas of Spitsbergen, of the archipelago, like the big island of Nordøstlandet, where we sailed past on our way to the island. But there's no scientific reason for it. It was just a political thing, and also that some people in the government didn't want tourists to be there. It has a very negative sound to some people, the tourists. But those people that get here, they come here for different reasons. It's not that they all sort of have the same values in seeing nature. Some just have been everywhere and want to be here and see animals. A lot of them want to see polar bears. But almost all people that have been here see the value of it when they have been here. It was a different place. There's a lot of things going on. Over-exploitation, mineral mining, whatever. Overfishing, there's still a lot of fishing going on that we don't see really. Deep sea fishing, modern fishing, big ships. And the life we see here is not original. Yeah, it's a shame. I would have loved to see it as a real wilderness, sort of unspoiled. It is very romantic. I know that. I do realize this is not a true wilderness anymore.
I think my number one reservation about joining the expedition was that I was super aware that I would be alone in taking an alternative form of transport than the aeroplane. And part of my campaigning has been to do with unnecessary air travel. And I think I was worried that a group of 17, 16 people choosing to take a number of flights to get out to the Arctic and then travel around the Arctic and then have some discussions, whatever that might mean, and then fly back was a kind of eco-tourism that I find challenging. My thinking on this has moved on. My thinking about what the project is has moved on. I think the number one issue with this project will be communication, and when I received an email kind of trying to pack in to one email what this project was and what it could do, and who it could speak to and how, I think I was a little bit incredulous about whether it could manage to talk to a lot of people about large issues when all it would be, or all I thought it would be, was a tugboat pulling a bunch of rocks around the coast of southwest England. And as this project, my involvement in this project has taught me and has shown me the development of what comes before that tugboat starts pulling these chunks of rocks around the southwest coast of England. And it's a really robust, not just a robust idea about the impact of climate change, the fact of nation states being unable to deal with all sorts of global issues and the need for a new way of thinking. It's also, I think that I've kind of watched that journey and I've been a part of those conversations that have developed that, and I've been a voice within 17 voices who have made that robust and who have made these issues come to the surface.
For me, the exciting thing about it is it's the only place you can go, or one of the very, very few places, that isn't a sovereign state, that isn't run along conventional lines. It's the place you go to get away from that. It's no man's land. So whenever anybody's talking about what we need to do in this generation, it's clearly got to be in this area of non-national problems. And one of the reasons why Nowhere Island excites me so much is because if you want to go one place where you can think about non-country problems, it's got to be a non-country place. And there are not very many places you can go to if you want to step outside, if you literally want to say, stop the world, I want to get off, because I want to look back on the world, a cold, hard, cool, objective look at this collection of countries and say what's wrong, what needs to be different, how can we start thinking about being good ancestors. The suggestions I've made is that the first question we've really got to tackle, or rather you have got to tackle, is what actually is Nowhere Island. I really think that needs to be addressed first of all, and I've got some suggestions. They're obvious ones really, but nothing wrong with obvious. The first one is that Nowhere Island is a group of people. No man is an island, but a bunch of men and women could be a Nowhere Island. And it's a sort of a think tank, if you like, a group of people who debate these issues, nationhood, and so forth. And that's what Nowhere Island is. It isn't actually a physical place. What it is a group of people. That's the first suggestion. That's okay, nothing wrong with that, except that there are so many groups of people debating lofty things all the time, and we're all a bit fed up with that. It's a bit like jazz. It's fun to do, but not much fun to listen to. The second one is that it's an experiment, laboratory, thought experiment, practical experiment, where rather than just discuss these things, we're not just a think tank, we're in a sense a do tank, in that what we're trying to do is we're actually trying to come up with some solutions. We're trying to find, if you like, some solutions to the problems around statehood, nationhood, multilateralism, shared global problems, and so on and so forth. So there's a specific agenda to it, rather than just a discussion group. You go one stage further along that purposefulness axis, and you get to movement. Nowhere Island is a movement. It's like the what are they called, the ocean states. It's a movement, or the organic movement, or something like that. What we're trying to do is we're trying to actually create the beginnings of a movement towards a different kind of statehood. That's fine. It's a bit more interesting. There are also a great many of those, and the trouble with trying to do one artificially is that you'll probably find that not everybody in the group agrees with it, and so there'll be a lot of people will walk out. You might attract other people, and you're always going to be chased by this horrible label of crank. And the fact that it's also an art project doesn't help. There's a stage even beyond that of concreteness, which is to make it in some way actually a physical place with territorial or legal rights which make it a place outside the community of nations. And the value of that is enormous. Because at the moment, you know, if we want an honest broker, if we want a place where we want to discuss Afghanistan or Somalia or somewhere like that, we go to Norway or Switzerland because, you know, they're outside the European Union. But come on, what we need is a place that's outside the world. And I just can't help feeling that this would be a great gift to mankind.
Okay, I'm going to stop there. Simon goes on a bit. But so you can see that at that, you saw a little bit of a hint of what was to come. But in the expedition, we began to have those discussions about what could this thing be. And I won't go on too long about this particular part of the story, but what was phenomenal was that we were led by this amazing feminist blogger called Laurie Penny in a consensus decision-making process to decide on the declaration of Nowhere Island, which took us 3 days, I hasten to add. This is it here. And there was great debate over the use of the term will. Nowhere Island's constitution is and will be cumulative and consensual. And most importantly, the declaration was made on behalf of its citizens. So there you began to see this shift between superior male, sole white male endeavor of claiming the land to say we were a group of people claiming this land on behalf of citizens that were to come. Now, meanwhile, in this story, all of this debate's going on in the Arctic Ocean. Hurricane Katia is blowing us away. We're setting up this new nation, which is going to be declared. And meanwhile, the British tabloids have got hold of the story. So I now wear my page 3 girl comment on Nowhere Island as a badge of honor. So we came back from that expedition of Utopia, to this kind of media coverage, which was phenomenal. And of course, what was beginning to happen was this separation out of the sculptural form of Nowhere Island, the bunch of rocks on a barge, to the conceptual underpinning of the whole endeavor. It was a very scary 6 months, but it did arrive. And it did take this 800-mile journey, beginning in Weymouth, here at the bottom, all the way around, 7 ports and harbours, all the way around to Bristol over 6 weeks. And we worked over 18 months with every port and harbour on that route to prepare for Nowhere Island's arrival. So what was beginning was, as Simon Anthol said, a kind of movement, a sort of anticipation of the arrival of this place. People had in their minds this sense of a nation that was visiting this floating island, and that began to snowball. So what we began to see happen, of course, is that it was in some ways a piece of land art, a displaced territory. It was, as the geographer on the expedition termed it, a kind of migrant rocks, if you like, displaced from one part to the other, but also a landscape moving through another landscape. I'm just going to forward this a bit. Sorry. I'm just going to talk over it while this is playing. This has got the beginning of it in the bit. And so it's very much that you could understand this work as emerging, as futurist writer Thomas Frey has said, a newly formed island with no indigenous people and no existing structures and government becomes a perfect laboratory for experimentation. So the process of dreaming how a new nation began, if you like, here in the island in 2004 with just Alex making this rather kind of heroic colonialist gesture, but soon spiraled out into the expedition and then further in the participation of people all across the UK and across the world. And as it journeyed around the southwest coast, it gathered around it a constituency of thousands of people from 135 countries across the world who contributed to the artwork as active citizens, which we're about to see. Now, whilst historically this form of public engagement might have been considered as a part of the project's kind of outreach or curated events around it, in fact, Nowhere Island self-consciously, from the point it arrived in Weymouth on the southwest, foregrounded the growing audience or citizenship as fundamental to the way in which the work unfolded, even before the island's arrival on the southwest coast. So Nowhere Island was not simply an island sculpture on the move, but to see it, to really see it as the work as a whole, you had to engage with the propositions, exchanges, disagreements, desires and demands of the Nowhere Island citizens. Each one contributed to a collective answer to the work's proposition. If we would have found a new nation, where would we begin? So when the island came through English customs, that was interesting. We had to prove there weren't microbes on the island as it entered British waters. And we also had to promise that we weren't going to sell it. The island was accompanied around its 800-mile journey by the Nowhere Island Embassy, which became a cabinet of curiosities designed and made by the artist Alex Hartley. It contained objects and stories, maps, stamps, propositions, activist leaflets, pamphlets, histories that encompass the story of Nowhere Island.
Maps as constitutional stuff written by the citizens that joined the
It dealt with nationhood, sovereignty. It had a lot of the documents from the cessation of from the Kingdom of Norway. And the most surprising thing about what began to happen was that the citizens of Nowhere Island, you could sign up to be a citizen of Nowhere Island at the embassy or online, began to stage welcome activities, some of which were planned and some of which were spontaneous, which involved citizen marches. So within the context of the kind of revelry around the Olympics, the parades, the carnivalesque festivities that were taking place, you began to see these citizen marches with the kind of tropes of activist things on hillsides with their propositions for the Nowhere Island Constitution. This is the ukulele band.
We welcome this new nation that has come from the far north to visit us here on our island. Soon she will continue her journey around the southwest coast. But for now and the next 9 days, she's ours to observe and enjoy. This afternoon we invite you to sign up to become new citizens, to hear the myth of her creation, and to visit the embassy and meet the Nowhere Island ambassadors.
Okay, so you start to get an impression of this extraordinary object becoming this sort of personalized in some way character. Someone actually, we had Twitter feeds for Nowhere Island speaking, and it became this object that quite genuinely began to describe the landscape in quite an interesting way. You see it describing the British summer here, moored in St Ives Harbour, here on the coast of Ilfracombe, a small Devon town, and here finally exiting under Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol. But the extraordinary thing about Nowhere Island, yes, there's full of humour there. Yes, there is a kind of game in it, but it did genuinely start to involve people in thinking about the very nature of citizenship, and began to bring people together to really think about the nature of themselves as citizens, the nature of belonging. So where is the work in Nowhere Island? Is it the sculptural form? Is it the embassy and the activities that emerged from it? The ambassadors, the conversations that took place, the 23,000 people that signed up to be citizens of Nowhere Island, the media coverage around it, the merchandise, the reverie of conversations of being a part of something, of being productive, the stories, the myths that were told about its origination, the citizen marches which provoked, the march within Tolpuddle Martyrs Festival, which is a unionist festival in which Nowhere Island joined, the festivals taking place around, in the hopes of young people and the propositions that were taking place. Now this is just a map which Amy Spires, who's here, put together, hey Amy, of the citizens in the southwest coast. And what you begin to see is that there's of course a concentration of citizens around the places that it was visiting. But what we also began to see was actually responses that were emerging from all around the world to Nowhere Island, in that people wanted to respond in their own ways. So for example, there were a number of national anthems that were composed. Someone registered their boat under the nation of Nowhere Island. Somebody set up a Nowhere Island radio station. We received letters and notes and drawings, all of which responded to this idea of a piece of nowhere from over 100 countries across the world. But by far the most interesting for me, being a political animal, aspect of Nowhere Island was the Nowhere Island Constitution, which you'll remember from the declaration was declared as not finished and not ready. We had a fantastic constitutional lawyer with us on the expedition team, and he talked about this as always in, like Nowhere Island itself, a state of becoming. It was a constitution that you could contribute to online with a proposition of 120 characters, Twitter-friendly, and people could like or dislike your constitutional proposition, and on a daily basis, the actual order of the constitutional propositions were determined by the likes or unlikes, using, of course, the mechanisms of social media. And Carl Gardner, the constitutional lawyer, said, "It will always be speaking, but listening is a part of our drafting work too. What a principle means to you today is no less important than what your daughter thinks of it tomorrow, and no more. All will have the right to be heard, and because new propositions will be made and responses will shift, our constitution is subject to change, not fixed, not final, not what's gone before." So people can contribute, as I say, on site to the constitution. Ooh, thank you. And I'm just going to run you through just a few little aspects of it, which will give you a sort of sense of, there's a brilliant analysis of the Constitution by Amy, which is her list of 150 propositions, which encompasses all the kind of bonkers ones and the serious ones at the same time. So some had this kind of character of course, the US Constitution, down to putting it succinctly, don't be a twat. Every Nowherean will be equal. There's a great deal of equality spoken in this constitution, so everyone will be equal. A sense of demarcation, are you an insider, are you an outsider, are you a Nowherean or not? There was also an implication of equal rights, as you'd imagine, and also instructional constitutional propositions. Know this and know that. No guns. No Costa coffee. This was my particular favourite. And then instructional healthy eating. Rather depressing 1984, all citizens will have to wear a smile. No cars on the island. And then, of course, there's quite a lot of things should be free. Education should be free. Free wine. Alcohol should be illegal. And then a great deal of contradiction in between propositions, often finding one constitutional proposition outdoing the other. This was my favourite, actually. I thought this pretty much covered everything. This I particularly found that those constitutional propositions which took an idea of the island in some way and a sense of everyone has the right to be nowhere, even if others think they should be somewhere. This is Amy's 150 selection of the constitutional propositions. There were 2,700 by the time the Constitution closed on the 9th of September. And that was the point at which the island exited Bristol. Now, in addition to the social media, the responses, the debates, the discussions, the participatory responses, the way in which this took over as a particular project, we had 52 resident thinkers. So a resident thinker of Nowhere Island every week for 1 year. And this was one of the most interesting ways in which the work brought in different participants from totally non-art perspectives. So, for example, we had the editor of the Occupied Times, Steve McLean. We had writers, we had poets, musicians, broadcasters, environmentalists, geographers, chefs. We had the fantastic Kerry Smith, who designed for us 10 ideas for Nowhere Island. And I was particularly interested in how the darkness of this work might emerge. So do you remember way at the beginning of this lecture when I was talking about what was recognizable. You know, there's many ways in which people talk about the kind of placards and the marches of Nowhere Island as being the sort of cheesy stuff, you know, that goes on when people want to participate in this work. But this work was also displacement. It was deeply uncomfortable in many ways. It called into question our sense of being an insider and an outsider. And this, for me, was a resident thinker piece, which I'll just see if I can play you all of it, by the artist Tim Etchells.
Dear citizens of Nowhere Island, as we stop in the shelter of a doorway in the thunderstorm, S holds out his hand to check the rain. The hand, the flatness of it, the openness, the question of it, the directness, the simplicity, the pragmatism, the straightforwardness, the sunshine. And maybe just the repetition of this gesture, which must be as old as the hills, or as old as the co-presence of hands and rain. Just a few thoughts concerning the island. Please let it not be that utopia with doves and waterfalls and soft white clothes and doors that open as soon as they're approached. And please let it not be that utopia with all in harmony and accord. And please not that utopia of agrarian fantasy, with all of us in touch with or at peace with the land, working the land together or weaving together in some endlessly temperate and agreeable climate, caught in simple pleasures, eating simple, wholesome food. And please, just as strongly, please, not that techno-utopia where no one works at all, since the machines, ever more clever and more skilled, more resourceful, are doing everything, hidden in basements, miniaturized or concealed behind the walls. And please, not that morbid utopia that so many churches speak of or hope for or promise, but only come the day, meaning after death. And not that utopia of absolute freedom, or that of total equality, or that of flattening creeds, races, genders, and all that into one single humanity or brotherhood. And not that utopia of original ignorance, Adam and Eve, the nakedness that is not nakedness, no thank you. And not that utopia of free love, or boundless and open desire, or that hallucinatory psychedelic utopia of the human dissolved into the universe. And not that utopia of the virtual with its useless pretended transcendence of flesh and biology. And again, please, not that utopia of endless oneness and endless accord, not likely peace or everlasting peace, not likely peace at all, and not the satisfaction of all desires, and not the exhaustion of all need, and please not an end to difference. No to the utopia determined by sense. No to the utopia determined by utility. No to the utopias of knowledge, understanding and progress. Please, not the uniformity of consent or that of placidity. No to the erasure of anger. Please, not the utopic reduction of human space to that of a prison in which all needs have been anticipated, prescribed or provided for. Please, not the reduction of everything to the realm of the solvable. Please, not some temperate climate of banality, cotton-wooled and perpetuated ad nauseum, not late capitalist laissez-faire bliss, not communistic brotherhood, not either theocratic order or rationalist decency, not some medicalized or genetically modified utopia in which all personalities and physicalities have been balanced, remixed and extended forever in a calculation of chemicals and genes. Please, not the utopia of the old and wise, and please, not that utopia of the young and the carefree. Please, not men and women in accord with each other in all possible combinations, or mankind so-called at accord once again with the animals so-called. No, not equality, not comfort, not acceptance, not even tolerance. We'll have none of it. A utopia of dispute might be better. a utopia of permanent contestation, anger, and the unruly. But not even these will satisfy. Let's have instead the utopia which resists all names, refuses all belonging, refuses all place, definition, or affiliation, i.e., not for us, that which can be dreamed or imagined, described or spoken of, and not for us anything that can be caught in the noose of 26 letters called an alphabet and hanged. Not for us what is offered, not for us what is given, not for us what is promised, not for us what is even possible. Not that, not anything of it, but everything, everything which is other than that. Friends, fellow citizens, acquaintances, enemies, I look forward to our eventual meeting and to your full adoption of these, my most reasonable demands.
Okay, so, yeah, so good. So good. Tim Mitchell's amazing. So what does Nowhere Island mean here in open engagement? I've written some words which I'm going to have to read because it's how I organise my thoughts. But for me, it kind of brings up all the difficulties, questions, challenges, disappointments of the work that we do. I understand Shannon Jackson spoke here last year. Is that right? Yeah. She's a really important person for me. Her work's really important. And in her book, Social Works, Performing Art, Supporting Publics, she spoke and said, for those who measure a work's success on its degree of community self-definition, its efficacy is measured in its outreach strategies, its means for providing access, the representational demographics of its participants, and its identifiable social outcomes. Having just written the evaluation report for the Arts Council of Nowhere Island, I know exactly what she means. Such critical barometers also worry about the mediating role of the artist, about whether an artistic vision enables or neutralizes community voices. But other critical frameworks question the concept of artist as community helpmate on different terms. Indeed, for some, a critical barometer starts by questioning the concept of community on which such work relies. To what does a term like community refer? Does it pursue or inform visions of harmony and consensus? Should a work seek to represent underrepresented voices or provide a shared forum for all? Does the helpmate model obscure other goals of artistic work that might use the language of critique rather than the language of consensus? Now, she argues for greater tolerance of the different fields from which critics, artists and producers might approach works, but we might take this even further in relation to Nowhere Island. There are certain works in the performing and visual arts in which we can see, I believe, both the aesthetic and social provocations occurring together, and which do not, as Claire Bishop argued in 2006, see autonomy and social intervention as contradictory. Such works do not require consensus, but neither do they require antagonism between the artist and a targeted community. So Nowhere Island arrived in Weymouth as the pyrotechnical celebrations began for the sailing events of the Olympic Games. The island territory, Nowhere Island, was unrelenting in its barren nature, very different from the green and fertile Jurassic coastal surroundings for much of the Southwest journey. And this alien characteristic was symbolic of a refugee. No one could go on the island, no fireworks were shot off it, no music gig played on it. Alex Hartley remains somewhat wary of describing Nowhere Island as an event, partly because it brings to mind Guy Debord's characteristic of spectacle as that in which shared experience is atomized, consumption is passive and without agency, foreclosing critical distance and creating a false togetherness. But Nowhere Island used the sense of anticipation of an event, this arrival of a visiting nation, the transience of that shared cultural moment of welcoming the island as symbolic of a nation of global citizens, to remake our sense of place and a sense of belonging through participation before, during, and after the event. Therefore, social engagement here extended beyond simply attending to the work of art, attending to its arrival, to co-producing what Nowhere Island was. Now, this required the commitment of an informed and involved temporary constituency, not a targeted community, but a community made by Nowhere Island, which gathered around it. Could Nowhere Island offer us the opportunity to move away from an abstracted idea of social engagement and participation as event-based and experienced collectively at once towards something ongoing, experienced sometimes individually, sometimes discordantly, which is enacted by us as citizens? Such a durational approach works by encouraging subsidiary audiences to form beyond the initial participants. And that's a really important thing for us in all of our discussions, which is how do these subsidiary audiences for our work respond to the work if not direct, immediate participants in the work? Or in the case of this, they were hosts of the work, permitting others to receive the project anecdotally, as you are now, through the dispersion of the narrative of the project, through viral and digital networks, through shared photographs, tweets, constitutional propositions, citizen certificates, and eventually through the small pieces of rock that the island was dispersed. Each citizen received a small piece of Nowhere Island. It was broken up after the 9th of September 2012. In this sense, and this comes back to this notion of public time and public space, time can contribute something to the artwork that is immeasurable, unquantifiable, and unknowable from the outset. In 2004, Alex Hartley never imagined this as a socially engaged work, something very hard to communicate to funders and stakeholders at the proposal stage. Participation is not then a relation or social encounter with artistic production, but is a socialized process necessary for arts production, which occurs through public time and not just in public space. So Nowhere Island didn't prioritize this moment of display or the event of the exhibition of the island. In many cases, the island didn't turn up because of the weather. So all people had was the conversations at the embassy, but did the work still exist? Yes, in my opinion. It allowed instead for an open-ended, accumulative process of engagement. Now, one of the things I wanted to end with that I found really, really helpful is the work of the Professor Lynn Froggatt, who is a British psychologist. And she has begun to talk about some new terminology that I want to leave with you for describing what's going on in works in which transformation occurs. She says, artistic outcome and aesthetic, whether conceived as aesthetic of process or of product, is not subordinate to other social agendas. The artwork remains an essential third object or point of dialogue between the arts organizations or artists and members of the public who are not arts professionals. To work as a third point of attention, so if you think of Nowhere Island as a third point of attention, which activates new interpretations, it must retain aesthetic integrity. So it must have that alien characteristic, that critical integrity as a work of art. And this enables it to endure as a third object that opens up ways of seeing things differently. Where it collapses as a third object, there may still be a pleasurable experience. So if we think of a kind of firework display, all those images I showed you earlier on, you know, you could say that those sort of collapse as a third object. And they don't sort of generate new forms of critical dialogue. It's this aesthetic integrity to which Nowhere Island aspired and to which we believe distinguishes the project from other cultural activities which offered immediate gratification, but which didn't generate new forms of transformation. And it's here that I think we find our argument for contemporary art in the public realm and particular social practice, beyond mass spectacle. It's here that we find the argument for investment in durational arts projects which evolve over time and space. Nowhere Island, through its existence as both a real place and a work of utopian promise, revealed the values and the principles of our times. It drew upon the aesthetic strategy of modelling as a process through which possible worlds were modelled or proposed, and in doing so drew out the failings of our society. Not enough free ice cream, for one. The Noah Island Constitution, unlike the format of the Art Manifesto, though, was not authored by the artists, but by us as participants. Its structure was defined by the artist to allow for a diverse and often conflicting set of aspirations proposed by its citizens. And in this sense, Noah Island facilitated change processes in individuals and communities by nourishing the capacity for creative illusion, to act or think as if things were different. Suzanne Lacey wrote a really beautiful piece on Noah Island, which I'd encourage you to read. She was one of the resident thinkers at the end. And I just wanted to leave you with her words. She talked about the relationship between the producer and the artist, which maybe we can talk about if we have time for questions, and the way in which this evolved from a sole male endeavour to a collective experience. But in particular, she talked about the image, and it's something that the students and I talked a great deal about on Thursday. Why are we in the visual arts? And for me, the charismatic image of the island was incredibly important, even from that first phone call from Alex Hartley, in which he said, imagine a floating island has arrived off the southwest coast. That charismatic image carried the power of this new nation. And I'd like to end with kind of perhaps an argument for a charismatic visual image at the heart of everything that we do. Thank you very much. So, I have some pieces of Noah Island here for really good questions. So, I've got two. So, yeah, here. Yeah. Where are you?
Thank you very much for this presentation, and I think this work is obviously very complex and well considered. But there was a part of it that really I felt I didn't really see a lot addressed, right? Because I know you've not been to Portland before, but you know, we're in the United States on land that began with grand colonial gestures. Right? And most of the nations that we have on this earth began with colonial gestures. And, you know, after the first image you showed, in which the artist was making this mock colonial gesture, you kind of immediately turned to saying how it was turning around these colonial gestures. But what I think we understand about colonial gestures is that they tend to spawn more of these gestures. And I noticed many of those throughout the point. I made a list every time I saw a colonial gesture that was different from him standing on the rock. But I wondered how in your work and in the response to the work, these other colonial gestures were addressed. The fundamental colonial gesture that is informing a nation and promising a utopia at the expense of others.
I think the answer to that is in that it became about personal responsibility. So what you found very quickly that we debated on the expedition was that we were not going to have a flag or any of the trappings of a nation. So we endeavoured to not put those out there, as if we were determining what those was, but how quickly the citizens of Noah Island from all over the world wanted to use those trappings and to invent those trappings as a way of kind of marking out. So even stateless citizens who became citizens of Noah Island, we had a lot of emails from people who wanted to become citizens of Noah Island because they felt that it would give them a visa to come to the UK. So which, you know, had to be really seriously acknowledged and responded to and taken very seriously. So in that sense, for me, it was a work which lifted the lid on that. It lifted the lid on my relationship to colonialism as a person and sovereignty, nation states, and my understanding of other people's sense of nationality. I think what changed was a sense of entitlement. You know, so it began with Alex's kind of gesture of entitlement and turned into much more a work in which one's own individual responsibility as a citizen became much more to the fore. So if you see the kind of the trappings of colonialism, you know, the kind of whatever it might be, the flags or the list that you've got, it partly those came up. Partly because of this sort of sense of, like people asked us if they could have passports, you know. We were like, no, you're not going to do passports. You can have a certificate that says officially you're a citizen. Partly because, you know, Alex's answer a lot of the time was, did you feel you should have one? You know, do you feel that you should have you want that marker of where you stand? So do you see what I mean? It was kind of became much more complex in terms of actually how it acted as a mirror back on what we feel is our entitlement or a right as a citizen. And certainly through some of the discussions of resident thinkers around the privilege of mobility, for example, and that many people who became Nowhere Island citizens can't leave their countries. Yeah, so it kind of brought into, in fact, one of the last people that signed up to be citizen of Nowhere Island, it was someone from Sudan who had got a job in India, and in fact her story is on the website. So it sort of became a way of discussing between each other. As citizens of Nowhere Island, we would never have been connected in that sense.
I have the mic. Okay, quick question. So the idea of public time is so interesting, and I was just wondering, as you take that forward, how is that idea informing and or manifesting in new projects?
Well, we had this interesting discussion the other day, didn't we, about temporary interventions versus durational permanent works and what kind of residue is left behind. In the case of a number of people that we work with on Nowhere Island, those relationships have been established, and certainly in terms of that kind of time of a project, the long-term legacy of this project, that will unfold in a number of other artist projects. But there's an interesting case in terms of our responsibility to the citizens of Nowhere Island, and I think that was a really difficult case. You know, it's like Suzanne and I have talked a lot about kind of exit strategies and one's responsibility, and it was really heartening to hear Michael yesterday talking about the nature of his relationship to the people he's worked with and the sense of where they are now. For this project, it was very important that it was a nation for a year. And in that sense relates back to the former question about what can a nation for a year achieve as a kind of catalyst for change. In terms of the time of an artwork, I think one of the things that we attempt to do at Situations is to challenge and shatter the idea of permanence being purely physical. And that's incredibly difficult still to do within the culture of culture-led regeneration. So my job is to, for instance, in Oslo at the moment, we persuaded over 2 years the city of Oslo to give salaries to the artists and activists and architects behind Future Farmers towards this permanent bakehouse. So we've turned that public art money into ongoing participatory work over a number of different years. So it's kind of partly also, it comes out of Nowhere Island and the understanding of how you have to get under the skin of a place for relationships to emerge. But it also, what was very interesting here was something that came out in New Zealand, which was a sense in which Nowhere Island kind of acted as just an interruption in those places for a very short period of time. In some cases, it was only there for 2 days, and yet people have been preparing for its arrival months ahead. So it's to do with that kind of third object and how it operates even before it's arrived. One more? Maybe one more? One more? Oh God, who's got a really ace question? Yeah, this lady here.
Thank you. I was wondering if very quickly you could speak a little bit more about the difference between a charismatic agent, a charismatic image, and perhaps a charismatic object, both for the making of art and also the understanding of art, or perhaps speak a little bit more about the relationship between charismatic agents and images and bureaucracy.
Good question. Okay. God, we haven't got very long. I mean, I think the charismatic agent it has emerged through the research we've been doing on durational projects like Jana van Heeswijk and artists like that, where we kind of recognize the nature of an individual as a catalyst to make things happen. Someone said to me earlier, you know, one of the questions they had for this conference was, why is it important to be artist in what we do? And I think that the very nature of an artist is you can go and propose something that people may have thought of but not done before, like a permanent bakehouse. And that to a certain extent, Amy Franceschini is a charismatic agent in that. And the thing to recognize with charismatic agents is that they have a lifespan, you know, that these projects can only be sustained for a certain period of time in a particular place. In terms of the charismatic object, it's a slightly different thing in that Nowhere Island, even though we gave it a personality in a sense, it's operating as this third object in that sense, which allows for people to have a discussion about the nature of their own nationality, their own fear of outsiders and immigrants and refugees in those very rural locations. And in that sense, it draws you to it and repels you at the same time. So there's a sense of this kind of charisma of this object, even though it's sort of a relatively alien, ugly, fairly barren-looking object. So they operate in the same kind of way, but obviously charismatic agents have agency. I don't think Nowhere Island in its sculptural form had agency. The work had an agency, and interestingly, I don't think that Alex would define himself in the same way as perhaps artists like Jana van Heeswijk would. He's an artist who said to me right at the beginning, Claire, I don't like people. And was rather shocked when he found he had 23,000 fellow citizens. So I think in that sense, he didn't act as a charismatic agent. The Nowhere Island did in his stead, if you like. Okay, I think we're going to have to wrap it up. I want to give the lady over there another question. Here you go. That's for you. Thank you.